Hi there and welcome. I thought it would be fun to show you how I'm using gouache to paint this fox illustration and share my favorite tips and techniques as I create this fun painting. I'll show you how I created the drawing, paint the different layers, how I think about color, and show you the whole process right up to my finished piece and what I made it into in the end. Last year I painted a fox in acrylic paints in a similar design. I always had the vision to create a Christmas version of it with holly, winter boughs, and berries, so I'm excited to get started. I decided to make it easy on myself and use the old original drawing I did for the flowers fox. So I scanned it, printed it, then I applied some soft pencil to the back. I used a 6B pencil and then transferred it onto my paper. I'm using the Strathmore Bristol paper. I then finished the drawing, adding in all of the details, the holly, other greenery, and berries. I decided to use this Winsor & Newton gouache. It's just an inexpensive set of paints. It's not their designer, professional gouache, but I wanted to give it a try. I do believe that you can get good results from less expensive supplies, but there's also a difference for a reason. I have a few paintbrushes set aside to use for the painting, depending on what I want to do. They're Princeton and Winsor & Newton brushes. I'll list all of my supplies in the description, including the colors of the paints I'm using as well. I'm starting off the painting mixing a dark teal green for the spruce boughs. I almost never use paint colors as they come straight from the tube. I always mix my colors so that I get a variety of shades. I started with this finer tip brush, but it wasn't working well with these paints. So I decided to switch out my brush for my Winsor & Newton shorter brush. The paint is a bit thicker because I'm using it out of the tube, so I needed this slightly sturdier brush to use. If you're using dried gouache and wetting it as you would watercolor, then you can get a lot more detail and use a thinner brush. But if you're using it this way, it's a little bit different. I wanted to use gouache specifically for this painting, so I could get more color vibrancy for this piece, as opposed to watercolor, which just takes a lot more layering to get such vibrant colors. So here I'm just layering in a base of the mixed blue-green for the spruce boughs, and I've decided to use this thin liner brush to paint in some of the details of the other greenery on the illustration as well. I'm making sure to mix very different greens for all of the different boughs and plants. When I'm mixing paints, I'm moving the shades around the color wheel. Here I'm adding a little bit of red to tone down the green and warm it up a bit. Then I'm adding the white to give it a soft color. I'm also always thinking about the values of the colors when I'm painting and making sure I have good variance throughout the illustration. The paint is pretty creamy and thick because I'm using it out of the tube, so that alone creates its own texture with gouache, which is fun to play with. For the holly, I want a really nice, vibrant, bright green because it's at the front of the illustration, kind of like the bow at the base of the wreath. I'm just continuing to fill in a base layer of color, creating variances in tone and texture as I go through. When I mix a specific color for something in the painting, I'll often use it in a couple of places so that there's some consistency and balance. Especially in an instance like this here, where you have the same species of plant in the painting, you want them to look right. This is such a pretty color. I'm mixing sort of a muted army or moss green. I'm using the burnt sienna and adding a little bit more orange to give it that nice earthy green color. This is a cedar bough here. They have that underlying warmer orange-brown tone in the trees. And again, I'm painting in the basic shapes and capturing some of the more natural, predictable lines with quick gestures using the brush. What I initially decided was that I'd add a few different species of tree boughs, branches, and berries to the wreath to give it both visual and color variants and textures. I really love white pine trees, they're one of my favorites. So I added some branches here. They're so soft and pretty, and it gives me an opportunity to vary the line work and add some other colors as well. I've started detailing them with a reddish-brown branch. It allows me to bring that warmer color into the greenery. I'm adding a kind of orange glaze over the green paint. This just gives it a little bit of brightness. My next step is to paint the berries. What I want to create is a really warm red. So I'm mixing the vermilion orange color and the magenta to give me more of a traditional red color. And again, just go in and create a base layer of color. As I'm painting the illustration, I'm adding some more berries here and there to give a little bit more dimension and interest to the piece as well. For the holly berries, I'm laying in a base that leans more towards an orange color because I want these berries to be a really bright, vibrant red in the end. When I paint, I tend to layer a lot of color, so I want these berries to have this bright base first. This paintbrush is one of my favorite brushes. It's the Princeton Aqua Elite Long Round Brush. It has a super fine and long tip, but is big enough to hold a lot of water and get some beautiful detail and marks when you use it with a watered down gouache. I want the white pine needles to be sort of soft and wispy, and this brush is perfect to capture that feeling as well as the nice gradation and watermarks from the paint. I'm painting the fox with a fairly watered down gouache as his base layer. I want it to be kind of like a wash, but the gouache gives you more pigment, so it allows you to create some beautiful textures and define the forms. So for this painting, I've used gouache in two ways: watered down like this as you would watercolor, and as a thicker, more opaque painting as well. I really like to use the pooled pigment and the really beautiful resulting textures for the shadows and darker areas in the fox. I'm using the paint to build up color and value in the specific areas. As I'm working on the painting, I'm pushing the water and the pigment around into the different areas where I want some darker colors. I really like to leave or create some of these really wet marks with a bit more pigment that create darker areas. I won't mix it in. I like to leave it to dry and create this sort of wet beading. Even with more realistic art, it just adds more texture and variance to the piece. As I'm coming back to the fox, I'm coming in with a little bit more paint. I haven't diluted down the gouache as I did previously, so it's fairly thick. Although gouache activates when you re-wet it, you do have a very little bit of time to apply it over past layers if you work quickly in single brush strokes. I'm not too worried about it here, but I also don't want it to mix too much and pull paint up and reveal the paper. I'm adding this yellow as more of a highlight on the base of the fox. Then I continue to layer and paint in more orange again. So in between coats, it's sort of dried a little bit as I'm applying this paint. This is a technique here that I use fairly often depending on the medium. I have a clean, wet brush, not dripping but just wet. And because the orange layer is not fully dry yet on the fox, I have a window where I like to lightly rub my paintbrush over some of the areas where the orange paint is thicker and still a little bit wet. This pulls the paint off of that area and reveals colors from the layers below, giving a really nice soft textured effect that resembles fur and a soft light reflecting on it. You can see on the fox's face and the tail where I've done this as well. Here I'm just adding in more darker layers where there's a shadow, and I want to sink that area back in behind the tail a little bit. I'll continue to add more black around the ears. I typically don't use black in my paintings. I usually mix a darker color so that it's based more as a cooler dark blue tone. I'm layering in more dark green and teal color so that I can create a more stark contrast between some of the foliage that's underneath the fox's fur, and so that I can make the fox's fur pop up better. Oh, I had a little decadent treat, a chai tea latte with some whipped cream. I'm continuing to build dimension by adding more highlights using a very light green, along with a more yellow-green washed into the holly leaves. I do this a lot with watercolor. I'm using a clean, wet brush again to remove some of the paint on the holly to reveal some highlights, and then come back in with a darker green to add some variation and shadows, etc. I'm continuing to layer in more green colors into all of the different branches and foliage I have in the painting to give the illustration a more rich, full feeling. I added some extra white pine branches down at the bottom to balance out the piece a little bit better. They look so pretty and delicate. As I get back to finishing the holly berries, I mix a nice deep red paint and layer it on top of the orange base layer. It really gives them a festive, bright color, and when I add an even deeper red as a shadow, they really start to pop. For the other berries, I'm adding another layer of a pinker color to differentiate them. As I did before, I use my wet brush and start to pull a bit of paint away from the holly berries to show light reflection, create dimension, and some contrast. I'm continuing to build more lights and darks to help the greenery pop, and adding more details to the fox as well. I always try to create a lot of variance in a piece like this. For example, with the branches, some are hanging over the fox and some are in behind his body, just to reflect the reality of an image like this, even though it's an imagined piece. Little details like that I find make a real difference. For some details, I really like to come in at the end with some pencil crayons. I'm using my professional Prismacolor pencil crayons. I love them, they're really great. I'm just cleaning up some edges, adding more contrast and details where I need it. I find pencil crayon works so nicely over watercolor and gouache because the texture of the paint when it's dry is kind of chalky, so it really creates a nice look. Again, I continue to add more layers of paint until I'm happy with the saturation and the final color of the dried paint. As a final touch, I'm adding some reflected light on the berries. I want them to look really bright and shiny, so I'm going in to add little highlights with white gouache. I'm also adding a nice crisp shadow on the holly leaves, which tend to be thick, so this adds some nice dimension and shadows as well. Lastly, I added in a few more final wispy white pine branches to balance the painting out at the top. And our cozy winter fox is finally all done. He turned out pretty cute, I think. I'm happy with the illustration, the colors, and the overall brightness of the piece. I've decided to make this into a card and maybe some tags for presents too. I hope you enjoyed watching the process of painting my illustration and it was helpful and relaxing. If you'd like to see more art-related content like this, you can join my Patreon for free now, with more content coming soon. And of course, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my next video. Thank you so much for joining me. See you soon.